Welcome. Today we go down into the depths of the sea and of history to understand how a nascent world conflict altered ideas about naval power, and why what German officers believed at the start of the Second World War turned out to be far from the whole truth. Shattering traditional assumptions, American aircraft carriers evolved from negligible niche contraptions into moving cities on water, while German strategic thought froze in the past. How and why did their original convictions about the weakness of these floating cities suddenly turn into fear and astonishment? What did the blend of old concepts and new reality open a rift from which there was no way back? And how quickly did Germany grasp that mobile, autonomous carriers were the future, rewriting every rule of the game? In this investigation, we will examine how shifts in perception and technology upended all naval strategy, and who stood behind this upheaval. Ready to see the hidden mechanisms of new maritime victories and understand exactly how the U.S. Navy won on the world waters? Then let's begin. At the beginning of the Second World War, the mood of the German Naval Command was tinged with habitual pragmatism and suspicion toward innovations lingering on the edge of military science and technology. Carriers were enigmatic giants, almost fantastical constructions that surfaced on the horizon of rumors and intelligence reports. Yet most officers regarded them more as specialized, marginal means than as fundamental pillars of modern sea power. Their vision of future naval battles rested on a classical concept: powerful battleships, well-protected destroyers, and submarines capable of presenting a threat at long range. In their eyes, the carrier was nothing more than a very vulnerable and temperamental exotic ship whose existence largely depended on the superiority of other fleet elements. It was fragile, if you like, and inextricably linked to the role of the British fleet, especially its powerful aviation and control of the air, to that very goggle, which could pounce on a ship out of nowhere and smash it with a single blow. The first reports coming from the Atlantic looked like mysterious, exaggerated silhouettes flickering on the horizon. German scouts often observed large dark shapes against storm or skyline, spawning distrust and skepticism. Part of the command staff considered these reports residues of fantasy, myths born of fatigue or poor interpretation. They were perceived in fragments, without proper confidence, as unfounded imaginings. Not everything could be explained by intelligence or cipher intercepts. There were vast distances separating them from real events, a shortage of precise data, deception, and optical illusion. Intelligence, intercepted traffic, and analysis were built on limited facts. The proofs were unconvincing. Photographs taken from German aircraft often failed to convey true scale, and radio intercept capabilities were imperfect. Even carefully collected signals could not fully reveal the power and technological complexity of U.S. carriers. Their driving force, aviation, which could quite literally materialize from nowhere and destroy even the mightiest ships. Germans perceived carriers as mythical monsters capable of overturning the familiar order of naval combat. Yet they still did not grasp the full measure of their destructive strength. Reappraisal began only with the arrival of real combat scenes witnessed in the heavy Pacific confrontations. Clashes between Japanese and American fleets, where gigantic carriers displayed their most fearsome qualities. For the first time, German officers saw American and Japanese carriers, like mythic ships, go into battle, merging aircraft and warships into a single lethal ensemble. They watched them in island battles, in convoy operations across the Atlantic, when air transports were accompanied by the thunder of explosions and the fleeting traces of rocket salvos. These episodes ruptured dense layers of disbelief and made clear a theory that had seemed fantastical was now reality. Gradually, over numerous encounters and clashes, the German command began to rewrite its assumptions. Evidence from technical experiments and observations of the fighting power of American and Japanese fleets. All this led to the conclusion that old concepts had grown obsolete. Carriers ceased to be exotic vessels for the skeptical mind. Striking them from afar was no longer a question of doubt. It became clear that a new piece had appeared on the board of strategy, one that had to be reckoned with. For the Germans, an internal question remained: their own strategic outlook. Why did they keep focusing on traditional models of sea power, battleships, and destroyers, over new realities? Why, despite an intellectual recognition of air-seaborne innovation, did their strategy seem chained to old dogmas, to the need to defend and dominate the maritime expanse with powerful, protected Britannia or with submarines? Where was the hidden source of this contradiction between the new face of naval battle and the conservatism in the leadership's minds? Deep inside, a question ripened and would not let them rest. How to halt a paradigm shift when more and more evidence testified that the old was not displacing the new, but merely trying to keep it afloat like a ghost of the past? The central conflict of this phase lay in the fissure between a traditional understanding of maritime supremacy and a new reality that no longer hid beyond a distant horizon but pressed in upon them. Initial skepticism, shaded by wonder, gave way to mounting anxiety. Why did this new type of ship seem such a hard-to-fight and latent threat, despite their own intelligence and observations? How did outdated doctrines still dictate decisions when their own eyes and evidence pointed the other way? And above all, what was the key to understanding this rift? Was it possible to accept that old weapons could yield to new, and that after years of strategic preparation, paradigms accustomed to battleships and coastal defenses would be unable to withstand air power erupting on the horizon? This became their inner trial, a test of reason, logic, and, more importantly, of their own historical memory. The transformation, it turned out, did not happen in an instant. It proceeded slowly, bit by bit, like ancient ice cracking under the weight of fresh proof and testimony. German officers realized that to oppose the new reality meant not merely to rework plans, but to rethink completely the role of their fleet in a world that was beginning to resemble an era of aerial chieftains and maritime illusions. How quickly and how radically could Germany alter its strategy after this shock? By what means did a change in perception harden into a new doctrine? These questions did not leave them to solitary reflection. They became part of committees in the hush of command rooms, the cashiering of old shipboard strategies that concealed within themselves a spark of change. The titanic struggle of old views with the new, and this was only the beginning of greater shifts that would shape history. For as the evidence shows, the realization of U.S. carrier power became a turning point, an archetypal fracture, a boundary between eras that conditionally closed one and fully opened another. This entire picture, far from a mere chronicle of moving from old doctrine to new, mirrored a deeper crisis, a crisis of thought, both strategic and technological. In it lay root causes, explanations for the irony of human nature, ready to cling to proven methods, even when they could no longer be defended in the face of hard combat evidence. And all this was only a prelude to what would follow, a swift, astonishing reconfiguration of German naval strategy in the era of American carriers. In the ocean's depths, where battle could burst forth at any moment, German officers arriving from the Atlantic shores were stunned. Their views, formed by centuries of European naval tradition, were meant to remain unshaken, solid ships, powerful yet still limited in capability, battleships and submarines. But what they saw on captured American carriers overturned their understanding of sea power, and it was this change that became one of the key factors reshaping the strategic map of global maritime conflict. Images molded from facts, proofs, and eyewitness accounts showed that the American fleet had not merely come to assist, but had created a new, unique kind of warship, a moving city, a balance of scale and technology unreachable for Europe. When German officers first looked closely at these gigantic feats of engineering, their first words, enormous cities on water, were no figure of speech but a reflection of reality. Concrete details recorded in their notes and reports spoke for themselves. Vast hangar bays capable of holding dozens of aircraft at once, service systems astonishingly advanced for the time, and scores of planes neatly staged and readied for launch. They heard the roar of engines, smelled oil and gasoline, and together it all created the impression that they were gazing not at a fighting ship, but at a metropolis concentrated upon the sea. The dimensions of these giants defied accustomed measure. Their length approached several football fields, their beam exceeded that of ordinary vessels of similar class, and the height of masts and islands rose like celestial beacons. It seemed to them they were looking at something extraordinary, beyond the familiar card deck scales of Europe's fleets. Not one of their ships, no cruiser or battleship, could compare with this. Not in length, not in internal volume, and certainly not in functionality. Inside, American carriers were an entire universe. They were struck by the provisioning systems and living quarters engineered to ensure autonomy, the ability to live, work, rest, and even entertain without leaving the ship. There were movie theaters, films, recreational programs, gyms, swimming pools, and messes, everything a modern person might need. The internal layout, organized with astonishing precision and automation, left Germans genuinely shocked. Automatic mechanisms, lifts controlled by computer systems, transport lines that move crew and cargo at lightning speed. All of it heralded a new era in the naval industry. Such a combination of technological sophistication, autonomy, and scale embodied ideas the Germans had not even suspected. America was building ships, cities afloat, that could conduct extended independent operations far from shore, without support or with minimal support, because they had their own repair shops, fuel stocks, and advanced supply systems. The question was brutally simple. How had a country with a smaller aluminum and steel base, without so strong a battleship tradition, managed to create such a vessel? Why could Germany, with its powerful battleships and ingenious submarines, not replicate this success? Where lay the essence of that technological and conceptual lead? These reflections ripened in German minds. It was not only the physical dimensions of the ships that tested them, but the very idea of internal autonomy, this lonely city sailing the seas. They began asking questions that had previously seemed irrelevant. What is the future of naval combat? Who truly owns information and technology? Why can't our own ships, battleships and submarines, reach such a level of development or even surpass it? Why had the Western fleet long since departed from old notions of sea power and created something more than mere warships? New territories, new forms of command, new concepts of a fleet's independence. This inner conflict, the question of prospects, of the value of a strategy that underrates the significance of technological progress, became the foundation for reassessing concepts of naval warfare. One thing was obvious. Those who built such ships were not just choosing between power and autonomy. They were forging an entirely different way to wage war. And the German side understood. Did they have any chance to build something comparable? Or had their traditional strengths, battleships and submarines, already grown obsolete beside high-tech, autonomous carriers? For the key lies not only in physical size or structural complexity. At the root is an idea. This city model at sea personified a new concept of maritime strength in which technology, autonomy, infrastructure, and mobility were equal lines of strategy. These ships were, for Germany, a kind of brilliantly lit beacon, a demonstrative example that a focus solely on traditional weapons was insufficient to defeat a modern foe. The task before the Germans was clear: understand and assess the scale and capabilities. A crucial part of that was their undervaluation of the Western concept. And though they acknowledged the strength of a traditional fleet, they did not take seriously the automated systems, the level of internal autonomy, and the strategic advantages the Americans possessed. What they saw became a true blow. The logical conclusion that the classical European naval strategy, based on powerful battleships and submarines, could not compete with more technologically advanced models. At the same time, recognizing the scale and autonomy of American carriers was the key to understanding that the naval battle of the future had already begun. It was not merely a stage of technological development. It was a conceptual revolution. And for the Germans, and for all who watched, it became clear the next generation of naval warfare was not only about images of rockets, salvos, and naval guns. It was a war of cities, cities on water, governed by systems, deployed around the globe, independent and tireless. The meaning lay here. In the future, dominance would rest not only on firepower, but on the ability to wage autonomous, self-sufficient war. And it was precisely this lesson, vividly demonstrated by American carriers, that would become the chief challenge for all Europe and, in the end, for the global concept of naval strategy. In the heart of the world ocean, a new erosion of traditional military notions arose, forever changing the rules of the maritime game. In the early 20th century, before radar had carved through the fog of ignorance and mechanics and technology unfolded with hurricane speed, the U.S. Navy launched a revolution that shook the foundations of old strategies and forced sea powers to reconsider their priorities. This was not merely a ship with a high flight deck and armor capable of firing heavy guns at long range. No, the American carrier became a mobile airfield moving through the marine abyss, like a huge metallic city able to sustain hundreds of people and operate at the edge of its capabilities. Inside its hull lay magazines of munitions and stores, repair shops, sick bays, and living spaces, everything that made the ship virtually autonomous. It was not just a daring design, but a unique complex able to serve as an independent sea base, functioning without recourse to nearby ports or shore installations. Look at the design of these ships, and you see they lack the heavy artillery that once defined a fleet's strength. Their weapons are fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, the main, virtually sole instruments of destruction. They rose from specially prepared decks, flying to targets hundreds of miles away with precision that inspired hushed awe in observers. The entire process of air operations was highly automated. Aircraft launched, recovered, and executed their missions with stunning speed and synchronicity, as if all the mechanisms of this moving city worked under the control of a single brain. It was exactly this level of automation, an innovation German strategists could not fully comprehend or predict, that proved decisive. Form-ups, dispersals, combat sorties. Everything unfolded with astonishing speed. Each aircraft was not just a machine, but a moving force of strategic potential, of global aims and political pressure. A U.S. carrier could launch and recover hundreds of planes, turning itself into an entire carrier cluster. Not one, but several airfields, afloat and always ready for battle. It may seem mere technical complexity, yet behind it stood a wholly different level of strategic thinking. A carrier is not simply a fighting platform. It is a weapon of the future, able to operate anywhere on the globe, regardless of external conditions, without needing land bases or ports. Such mobility, this autonomy. Back then it sounded like a direct challenge to old naval dogmas and to a tactics built on massive gunnery duels at sea. So what lay at the core of this technological and tactical revolution? What is the fundamental difference between the old notion of naval battle and the new concept? The answer lies in the gulf between the static and the dynamic, between mass and mobility. Old fleets, like the battles of Gongut, fought for dominance through drawn-out artillery duels. Their weapons, heavy guns aboard, were meant to entrench a static position, to destroy the enemy at range, to wage sea battles in which each ship strove to hold its ground and inflict defeat without leaving its bastions. But that was a conflict of an old era when command of a narrow strait, a port, or an island decided everything. By contrast, the American revolutionary approach shattered these dogmas. Their carriers created an entirely new image: mobile, fast, autonomous platforms able to deliver destruction anywhere in the world. They uprooted the need for static positions and massive artillery, replacing them with jet aircraft, guided missiles, and torpedoes. This was not only technological development. It was the birth of a new geopolitical paradigm, a new type of war in which speed, automation, and air power became paramount. This revolution, however, provoked resistance and questions. Why could a fleet built for traditional naval battles not adapt on the spot to these new realities? Why could Germany, with its celebrated naval workshops and shipwrights of mighty battleships and armored vessels, only partially understand, let alone reproduce, such concepts? The situation was this: German naval thought remained confined within old dogmas. Smooth armor, heavy artillery, powerful protection, all for static clashes. And, frankly, it was hard for German strategists to grasp at once that these new ships were not just big ships, but entire complexes, airfields at sea. They lacked in their arsenal that level of technology, of automation, of aircraft that the Americans were building. At first, the very idea of a mobile, self-sufficient aviation ship seemed incredible to them, illogical and impractical. German flotillas, renowned in the era of Gongut-style battles, were built upon mighty battleships capable of conducting long, blind gunnery duels. They believed in heavy guns and dismissed the concept of air attack as a breakthrough tool. Meanwhile, the Americans moved only forward, demonstrating that the future belonged to speed, mobility, and aviation that could not just support a fight, but initiate it. Naturally, this raised another question. Could Germany create analogous moving cities at sea? Could its engineers and strategists reorient to the new reality? Was there any way to take their old masters of shipbuilding and convert them into modern platforms able to compete with the new American standard? These questions nagged because it was obvious that the next steps in naval war would be determined precisely by these new concepts. What did this technological revolution mean for the future? It did not merely change tactics or technology. It predetermined the course of world wars. The age of dominant heavy ships and gunnery duels was receding. Combat shifted ever more into the air and onto the sea. where the principle of speed and precision ruled, and the very idea of a compact fleet moving at the speed of a horn blast seemed revolutionary. Armies and flotillas became self-contained weapon systems with their own strategies, tactical methods, and technological advantages. There was no longer time for long deployments, for sieges and attrition by overwhelming firepower. The point was swift defeat. One strike, one sortie, one battle. This revolution set new standards in the struggle for control of the seas and became the pivot that ultimately shaped the outcome of large-scale wars. Carriers were not mere transports. They were machines capable of determining the course of history, fusing technology, tactics, and strategy into a single whole. The great powers understood this too late, and those who dismissed it yielded positions that could never be regained. These new, mobile air-sea platforms, harbingers of future generations of military technology, changed everything we knew about naval war and pointed to the inevitable, forward, into the ocean of the future, where speed and automation are the keys to power. In the very beginning of 42, when the dust had not yet settled after the first clashes in the Mediterranean, the world heard a new sound. The quick, confident approach of aero engines gaining altitude over the sea's mirror. That sound did not belong to ordinary battle squadrons. It rose on the horizon as a symbol of change, the appearance of American carriers in a zone where battleships and heavy cruisers had previously dominated. The time when naval battles were decided exclusively in messianic clashes of mighty guns and armor was slowly passing. Taking the stage instead were light, mobile, nearly invisible platforms. Floating air bases capable of delivering blows with unprecedented precision and a potential that could flip the strategic picture upside down. The first years of war in the Mediterranean were saturated with fights for control of vital lines of communication, for strategic nodes and port cities. In that struggle, both sides, some holding, others advancing, felt the growing power of aviation tactics. With carriers' arrival, changes comparable to a revolution began in this theater. Carriers broadened the operational possibilities of Allied forces and raised naval combat to a new level. The Royal Navy was hardly a novice in sea fighting, but it was the American carriers, entering several key Mediterranean points, that displayed unique flexibility, mobility, and strategic value. No one had seen aviation adapt so quickly and precisely to changing conditions, to screen convoys, shield amphibious operations, or strike shore infrastructure, all of which had seemed out of reach in the past. This new tactic showed itself vividly in the North African campaign during the operation codenamed Torch. In that struggle, where fateful decisions were made under uncertainty, carriers proved not mere auxiliaries but principal players. Their presence made it possible to cover maritime convoys carrying unprecedented volumes of material, weapons, and provisions. Atypical naval confrontations with inevitable choke points and obstacles. All this became the responsibility of airborne platforms. Using carriers in these operations meant that past shorebound, static methods of defense ceased to be effective. They could not compete with the mobility and speed, with the capacity for instantaneous response, inherent to aircraft operating from a relatively compact but powerful ship. Aviation provided control over the sea's surface, over the flow of events, over the fate of the entire operation. Later, in 1943, the assault on Sicily became a vivid example of how naval power, reinforced by carriers, turns into a decisive factor. The landings of American, British, and Canadian forces succeeded despite anxious moments and hardships. What matters at the zero mark is to see that this success owed not only to the number of assault battalions, to air cover under seasoned pilots and commanders, but also to the presence of carriers, the new, mobile weapons that could, by their mere appearance, change the course of battle. Their great ships and deck-based aircraft smashed defensive positions, creating the sense that at sea this was no longer just a contest for control, but a full-blown transformation of the entire tactic. When such confidence in their superiority, why were the Germans expected to shield their shores and traditional naval strategies, forced to admit they were lagging? The answer lies in indisputable evidence. Aerodynamic power, platform mobility, quick reaction capability, and the ability to animate air operations without national bases or major shore infrastructure. This all rendered classical coastal defense systems obsolete. Before the power of airborne platforms aboard carriers, defensive plans went stale and military engineers and strategists began asking, what next? What means can check or destroy these mobile sea bases? The answers lie in analyzing why Germany failed to counter this revolution effectively. The explanations are simple. German naval tactics, still grounded in classical strategies, were unprepared for carriers' mobility and elusiveness. Their coastal defense, a mesh of fortifications, minefields, escort vessels, could not adapt to the new reality. Lacking insights, technologies, and tactical reserves to force a fight on the air fleets, the Germans came to a bitter realization. Their strength was insufficient. Soon it became obvious that maritime power and control over sea communications were passing to those who could command airborne platforms, to the Allies and their carriers. Empirical testimony, proofs upon proofs, was irrefutable. The superiority demonstrated by American and British carriers was not a mere brush upon the sea. It turned it into an arena where the struggle for control was waged on a new level. They did not merely churn the spray or make noise in the skies. They changed the rules of the game. What was, what is, and what will be, all attested to a shift in the balance of forces in naval strategy. A balance that finally receded into the past, ceding place to a new age, the age of aerial mobility. How critical was this change? The answer is that such first-of-their-kind operations not only altered the current picture of the military world, but also foreshadowed the large battles ahead, in the Atlantic, in Europe, and on other stages. Campaigns in which control of sea communications became nearly decisive. In this context, one must ask, what will the future tell us? What lessons were learned in practice? What facts and consequences sealed the dominance of airborne platforms? And at what price were these revolutionary shifts secured? The answers lie in plain view. They are evidence that in the history of wars, even the harshest and bloodiest, victory often goes not to those who fire the loudest, but to those who are smarter, more mobile, and able to foresee the coming era. Thus, the story of American carriers in the Mediterranean is not only a chronicle of tactical steps or strategic decisions. It is the harbinger of sweeping changes prepared for the future of naval war. It is the greatest lesson proving that in a world of weapons and power, where control of the sea becomes control of nations' destinies, it is the air that embodies the new strength, the new authority, the new era that is only beginning. On that June day, when the Battle of Midway entered its decisive phase, it seemed the history of the Pacific theater changed forever. The roar of explosions and the uppercuts to exhausted Japanese carriers, engulfed in flame and smoke, became the symbol of a new era of naval war. At that moment, it was obvious. The day's fate was decided not by armies ashore, not by land bases or sea fortresses. Everything was decided by air power, by strategic reconnaissance, and by precise strikes. 4 Japanese carriers, once the unshakable pillars of the Imperial Navy, were destroyed in a matter of hours, the result of carrier tactics that forever altered the principles of naval combat. Ironically, it was there, on the spacious Pacific, that the strategy was born which would later prove invincible, a strategy in which aviation displaced all other means. On those waters, in that battle, American air tactics showed their strength and flexibility as never before. Their approach differed fundamentally from what European sea powers were used to. Americans focused on constant, precise attacks from long range. They often employed reconnaissance aircraft equipped with radiogoniometers and relay gear, allowing them to detect Japanese ships long before they themselves could be seen. This was not mere cold calculation. It was a precision blow grounded in exact data obtained through meticulous intelligence. U.S. carriers did not limit themselves to defending their groups. They created an atmosphere of constant threat that came from nowhere, a shadowy presence that kept the Japanese perpetually on edge. Emotion, anxiety, and tension intertwined with the accuracy of calculations as Americans launched their attacks. Their aircraft appeared as if from nowhere, struck, and vanished, leaving Japanese command in complete bewilderment. It felt as if the opponent was not merely protected, but intent on not being seen, intent on making his attacks sudden and devastating. These tactical methods stood out sharply against the German naval doctrine, more patriotic and less flexible, where ships often became sitting targets. America's successes in the Pacific were not limited to the destruction of Japanese carriers and their fleet. Thereafter, virtually the entire island-hopping campaign, from Guam to Peleliu, rested on carrier groups. Enthusiastic assessments and plans held that the presence of powerful carriers effectively replaced the need for land bases. all logistics, all fighting capability relied on these floating airfields that could be directed wherever Japanese or German forces might be. They became mobile, swift, acting with precision and speed, like spacecraft of the future, rendering the old naval front, static and stoutly fortified, obsolete. Such a future was obvious, and it did not come without what one might call revolutionary flexibility. Rapid repair and restoration of the ancient titans, their replacement by new or strengthened counterparts. This thunderstruck theorists and strategists. After Midway, it became clear that large ships no longer stood on a pedestal as an untouchable value. The crucial factor now was the potential for rapid repair, mass production, and rapid deployment of new carriers. This fact shattered German beliefs about the rarity and supreme worth of their battleships and heavy cruisers. For now, well-armed carriers could operate relentlessly, unafraid of losses or delays. One key question when analyzing this era is, why exactly did the United States achieve such leadership in carrier construction and strategy? Why were their aircraft, their ships, and their tactics so superior? The answer lies in a unique combination of political will and technological achievement. Americans bet on mass production, on scale that gave them the edge in every clash. Their engineers, strategists, and intelligence specialists fused new materials, new technologies, and new tactics into a single space, creating a front dominated not only by force, but by skillful use of information. At times it seems this entire strategy was prepared not at the front, but in rooms of analysts, diplomats, and engineers, by sunny windows and on roaring factory lines. But what if the success was the fruit not only of technology, but also of ideology? Perhaps the confrontation between two great fronts, America and Germany, was not merely a struggle for resources and territory, but also a fight for maritime dominion, where each country sought to lock down key routes and logistical arteries. The U.S. fleet, anchored on carriers, found itself in a position of advantage in global strategy. It could penetrate to the very heart of the maritime world, the Atlantic, where fears of possible German counterblows from the sea always hovered like a shadow. If you think about what it would have meant for Germany had American carriers, akin to those that plied the Pacific, appeared in the Atlantic, the possibility of breakthroughs and penetration into strategic zones, from Gibraltar to Galicia, might have significantly altered the war's course, cutting the German fleet off from vital trade routes and key ports. Understanding this clarifies, American victory in the Pacific was not merely a local achievement. It foreshadowed a broader reshaping of the entire architecture of world sea power. This question opens a vast panorama of the future. Did American carriers become not just an instrument of victory in one war? Were they the forerunners of a new concept, global maritime supremacy that would define the balance of power in a new epoch? Perhaps their mobility, capacity for instant mobilization, strategic flexibility. All this would become the foundation not only for victory in a military conflict, but for cementing the country as the principal maritime charter of the future. And the main question before us now is, was the influence of that Pacific victory really so great on global history? Could that victory be the herald of a new world reputation for the United States, fixed not only on land and in the air, but also on the seas, where nations' fates are decided upon open swells and rolling waves? The answer seems hidden in a multitude of small events and strategic choices that lead to one central truth. The rift in history that opened on that June day showed the world that the future of naval war lies with carriers. And victory in the Pacific became not only a lesson for opponents, but the first stone in the foundation of a new era in which supremacy will be defined not by the might of great ships, but by intellect, technological progress, and strategic foresight. After the devastation of the Second World War, when the light of global recognition dimmed in the shadow of ruins and loss, the German fleet faced not only defeat, but the inescapable reckoning with its role, its mistakes, its limits. In those years, as published reports and memoirs began to filter through the lens of time, one thing became evident. Much that had once seemed unshakable truth proved to be obsolete dogma, and enlightenment arrived through a hard realization. Their concepts, their strategy, their armament all proved insufficient, outdated, and ultimately losing in the face of a new, rapidly changing form of naval combat. Immersing oneself in these recollections, like a melancholy yet vital drama, one can trace how many German admirals finally admitted that their initial ideas, their old concepts of sea power, Battleships with heavy armor and massive guns, and a predilection for submarines, were utterly unprepared for the challenges of a new era. In their reports and memories, one hears an indisputable fact. They felt that all their prior notions of sea power were, in essence, symbols of bygone centuries, bristling with outdated tactics that could not withstand the flexible, mobile, well-organized carrier tactics of the United States. And this realization did not arrive in a single day. It grew, took shape, and became clearer with each new engagement, each defeat, each account of the scale and organization of American carrier task groups. These ships shook not only fleet formations but expectations and dreams of grandeur. They were hard to comprehend, impossible to grasp within old strategic frames. Their testimony carried a word that could neither be explained away nor ignored. It was the unfathomable, astonishing, lurking beyond the horizon of understanding. It was a revelation that finally undermined faith in the supremacy of capital ships and ossified fighting traditions. The past seemed to vanish beyond the horizon, yielding to a new concept of multi-purpose, mobile systems that could not only fight but avoid combat, transforming space and outplaying strategic layouts. Battleships, submarines, even artillery. All these means were re-evaluated and transformed through the prism of experience driven to despair by defeats. The moment came when it was clear, theories of supremacy of heavy ships, when their steel rings seemed unbreakable, had fallen in a swift and final decline. In post-war analyses, one hears that these traditional ideas were an illusion, that the machinery of massive warship construction, their armor and power, did not guarantee success against modern, adaptive tactics. Analysts were unequivocal. Germany did not lose merely because of tactical mistakes or battlefield misfortunes. Its defeat was the product of systemic constraints, internal and external. Internal, born of narrow strategic thinking, resource scarcity, and technological shortcomings. External, of an inability to oppose the technological superiority of U.S. carrier groups, their organization, and tactical flexibility. That was the key to understanding. Defeat was not only the outcome of weak decisions, but a systemic result pointing to the need to rethink the entire future concept of naval warfare. But the main question around these revelations remains. How could it happen that German naval thought became stuck in old dogmas? How could they fail to notice, fail to grasp, fail to prepare for a new form of war? The maritime form as Western specialists imagined it, already cresting on the horizon. Why did so many leaders, admirals, and strategists fail to adapt their ideas, fail to understand the scale of the changes already underway? These questions keep not only historians in suspense. They embody the fear that even today we may be blind to new, revolutionary aspects of war, to technologies that will change the rules at their root. Military analysts concede. The lessons of the past must be our guide if we are to avoid repeating them. Every new challenge requires a new strategy, new tools, new thinking. And finally, we must ask, what next? Is today's prospect of naval battle merely the development of technologies and armaments? Or is it a broader rethinking of strategy, a deep transformation in step with the times? Perhaps the present and the future are not only new ships, drones, or hypersonic platforms, but a new philosophy, a readiness to discard obsolete dogmas and to recognize that victory is won not only by force but by intellect, flexibility, and willingness to change. Time sets its terms, and every era shakes old foundations and places first not a heap of war machines, but a strategy capable of responding to the challenges of a new age. That is the chief lesson. The future of naval warfare is not only technological progress, but a re-evaluation of the human being, his ideas and his decisions. For war is, above all, a contest of minds.